Hello and welcome to my video on my thoughts and experience of Necromancy at the playtest that I and many other creators were fortunate enough to be invited to. I know this video is very delayed, but I wanted to wait for all the information on the new skill to be released and for the embargo to be lifted so I can provide you guys with a more holistic viewpoint. In this video, I'll be going through the various elements of Necromancy, presenting my detailed opinions on them, and being open on the feedback I provided JX. I actually ended up retconning about 3/4 of this script since they improved and fixed most of them. Ultimately, my intention with this is not to scrutinize the upcoming content, but to ignite conversations around what people would like to see be changed or added after the release of the skill. Alright, let's get right into it. Let's start with the tutorial. The tutorial overall was very concise, as with most modern RuneScape tutorials, which I don't think they get enough credit for. It swiftly teaches players the core mechanics of the skills, including both rituals and combat, with a story integrated into it, which is personally an aspect I really enjoyed of archaeology. So I'm excited to see how it's fleshed out in Necromancy. With Necromancy, once you unlock a new ability which introduces a unique combat mechanic, the game pops up tutorial-like text boxes which thoroughly explain how the ability works. Even though this is good enough, I think it could be better. What if there were mini quests for skills to teach players step by step whenever they unlock something complex? For example, when gaining a required level for Residual Soul, the game notifies a player clearly to visit Malignus at the city of to unlock the new ability that you partially unlocked by reaching the required level. After talking to Malignus, he makes a player aware of the soul gauge below their adrenaline bar as a means to monitor how many stacks they have. He then instructs you to use Soul Sap on loop, similar to Skelly from a roguelike game called Hades. Afterwards, he directs your attention to one of the 3 souls filled on your gauge, explaining what it means and how it can be used. He then instructs you to use Volley of Souls to use up the souls. Malignus clarifies that you can have up to 3 stacks of souls, tasking the player to gain 3 stacks and then use Volley of Souls, explaining that it's more DPS if you use 3 at a time. This would only take a few minutes at most and ensures players don't get lost when learning how to use Necromancy. The time spent doing this could also be compensated by awarding a worthwhile chunk of XP. Another suggestion would be that the ability icons of Volley of Souls and the recasting of Conjurations could light up with a silver border to indicate to players that they can use them. And further, the border could turn golden when you're at the respective max stacks. This is the first combat style since the conception of Evolution of Combat, so they have a clean slate opportunity to make it intuitive and easy to learn. I would also love to see something similar to what I suggested for both Necrosis and the various Conjurations, knowing that if you press it, you will get the most out of that ability. Next, let's move on to the big one, abilities. One of my favorite features of Necromancy is the auto attacks and what it means for the combat gameplay experience. Basic rotations in RuneScape have always been difficult to juggle while PVMing, and a lot of those inputs have very little meaning other than just doing slightly more damage. I'm not going to go into depth on this topic, but an example of a meaningless basic melee ability would be Decimate, and a meaningful one would be Greater Barge. Necromancy's basic rotation is effectively auto attacks, which is a good thing since it allows a combat style to have a lot of intricacies using exclusively meaningful abilities without overwhelming players or bloating their action bars. Another aspect of Necromancy that I love is the fact that there's no thresholds, which allows for a greater depth of complexity. I've always found the arbitrary rules of abilities to be very constraining when it comes to creative playstyles. Imagine if a lot of these special attacks that players use with Essence of Finalities are not only integrated into core abilities, but also have direct synergistic effects with other abilities. The possibilities are truly endless. Conjurations are an iconic part of Necromancy, but it's also one of my biggest fears with the combat experience. I'm talking about the automated control of these units. To put it into perspective, summoning familiars have been around for over 15 years and have had more updates and bug fixes than I can count. And still, to this day, they're not perfect. They're way better than they used to be, but they still run into some issues like getting stuck on dead or phased enemies. It is imperative that the control and use of these units are flawless. During the playtest, I ran into a list of issues when using them, but to be fair, it was still in the process of development, and Mod Ryan assured me that they will be far smarter than summoning familiars. I didn't play around with the zombie conjurations a lot, so I might be wrong here, but I believe you initially cast the ability to summon the zombie and have them attack your enemies. Then you can recast the ability a second time to have them blow up for AoE damage. From what I remember, the AoE damage is dealt around the zombie itself rather than around the selected target, which intuitively makes sense, but it would make it annoyingly difficult to precisely position the zombies to get the desired result. RuneScape is already a very mechanically challenging game, and the last thing I would want is having to micromanage Conjurations. They could have a similar targeting system to vulnerability bombs where you can use the ability then target the ground or a monster manually, or have it interact exactly like the detonate magic ability where it automatically blows around your selected target or around itself if no target is selected. The zombies could also rush over to their target before blowing up in cases where the player targets something far away from their current position so it's still visually accurate. With the amount of conjurations expected to be an encounter on top of familiars, I think it's time to have a visual declutter where you can turn other players' visual effects off that you do not need to be aware of. Examples are familiars, conjurations, magma tempest, scripture of when, aftershock, insight, fear, and the list goes on. While we're on this topic, I think players shouldn't have the option to target conjurations or familiars with things like blade dive or bombs to prevent misclicks that end up nulling the action, especially considering how many possible misclicks there will be with the addition of Necromancy. Currently, the only way to monitor your conjuration duration and stacks is via your buff bar, but it's visually overwhelming, especially considering that those varying numbers are constantly changing when you have all your conjurations up. I would much rather have a dedicated UI for conjurations similar to summoning familiars. Staying on the topic of conjurations, they could even completely rework conjurations by making them permanent as long as you're using necromancy, taking away the need to summon and maintain them. Playstyle diversity could be created by limiting the number of conjurations, and mechanically you'd still have to recast their abilities at correct timings. Life transfer then could for a period make conjurations deal more damage, generate adrenaline, heal a portion of the damage that they deal, or amplify their effects. There were valid concerns revolving around players using necromancy purely for conjurations while mainly using a different combat style. My solution to this would be to have conjurations persist even when using an off-style weapon, but have them deal 0 damage and prevent them from building any kind of stacks, behaving exactly like Magma Tempest when using melee or ranged weapons. Moving on to incantations, I don't know how I feel about the existence of Split Soul within Necromancy, which for people who might not know is the Eldritch Crossbow special attack. It's one of the core identities of range alongside ammo. It's unnecessary homogenization. Not to mention that Necromancy doesn't deal that many hit splats when compared with other styles, and a lot of those hit splats are pretty large in number, which both are counter-synergistic to the Split Soul's effect. Moving on, Necromancy has an incredibly short attack range at 6 squares, which is 1 square shorter than crossbows. I don't know how I feel about this, but I know it can be very frustrating using a style with short range when fighting a lot of bosses like Zamorak and Solak that have a large area and require a lot of movement. Maybe Necromancy could have a mobility ability that could be used off global cooldown and dealt no damage that would allow players and their conjurations to teleport to their selected target regardless of range, with the drawback that you could only teleport to an attackable target rather than being able to freely dive or surge in any direction. This ability could be locked until a specific Necromancy ability is used to prevent players from just switching to the style for the use of mobility. For example, when using Living Death, players could obtain 3 charges of this ability to use during the 30-second buff period. RuneScape can be a very fast-paced game, with a lot of moments where players are killing targets within ticks, and from my experience, Necromancy has a significant backload of damage and not a lot of immediate burst damage, so it might suffer from similar downsides as if players were using exclusively big arrows. Another factor is that players move and change targets a lot when PvMing, and they wouldn't want their Conjurations to experience significant amounts of downtime considering they'd be a large source of their damage output. An easy way to solve this would be to allow melee Conjurations to attack from afar or allow them to dash to their new target. I personally wouldn't mind if Necromancy isn't on the same DPS level as the other existing styles. I'm mostly excited to have a fun experience and I'm looking forward to the potential it holds in the future. However, at the same time I can understand that first impressions are very important, and if the application of the skill ends up not being worth using anywhere, it could be bad. Continuing on to the next topic, and potentially my most controversial one. Talents. This might not be what you're expecting. On top of your usual unlocks you earn through leveling, this talent system is effectively an additional set of unlocks that players obtain by doing a combination of combat, rituals, and quests. I really love the fact that players have to do a variety of content to gain talent points, similar to archaeology qualifications. However, I think there's a massive missed opportunity by allowing players to have everything active at the same time, giving no room for creativity through limitation. Now hear me out. In most games, talent systems offer players a certain amount of talent points which they can use to spec into a tree of passive effects, abilities, or modifiers akin to greater abilities, with a caveat of giving players enough points to create a synergizing playstyle, otherwise known as a build, but not enough to have everything enabled. I believe this kind of limitation would allow for more gameplay defining unlockables, which would in turn promote players to customize a variety of builds that suit their playstyle. And before you say, Omid, people will just figure out the best build and everyone will just use that. RuneScape can be such a mechanically demanding game that I don't believe the best will always be the most used. An example is the fact that Divert is better in most cases when compared to Resonance. There's a limitation of them sharing cooldowns, but most people continue to use Resonance because players prefer it. If they make the unlockables competitive and offer definitive but unique benefits, I believe there's a very good chance to encourage variety. I think it would be really cool if you could customize your abilities, conjurations, and incantations through the talent system, very similar to Diablo 3 with the rune system. An example of this with an already existing ability would be Cleave. The original Cleave deals 37 to 188% damage in a 2x3 area in front of the player. The first variation of this could be that Cleave deals 120 to 180% damage in a 2x3 area in front of the player, but deals 20% more damage to the main target for each other target hit, making it incredibly powerful in scenarios where you have a bunch of monsters surrounding you but you're mainly focusing one target, like Taraket. A second variation could be that Cleave deals 50 to 170% damage in a 3x5 area in front of the player and reduces the cooldown of Meteor Strike by 1 second for each target hit. A third variation could be that Cleave deals 100 to 140% damage in a 2x3 area in front of the player and heals for 20% of the damage they deal, but the cooldown is increased by 50%. If only one target is hit, it heals for 50% of the damage. A fourth variation could be that Cleave deals 80 to 200% damage in a 3x3 area around the player, similar to Hurricane and Quake, but no longer generates any adrenaline. And a fifth variation, now I went a bit wacky with this one, but Cleave could deal 70 to 190% damage in a line 8x1 in front of the player and generates 100% more adrenaline. This would stack with effects like Fury the Spore and Meteor Strike critical strike buff, but has a 300% longer cooldown. I'll even take it a step further. Every style has their core basic abilities, whether you're using dual wield or two-handed. For example, Magic dual wield has Concentrated Blast, while Magic two-handed has Sonic Wave. What if there was a talent that allowed players to change how the Necromancy core basic ability works? In other words, the auto attacks. So the base version of auto attacks for Necromancy deals 90 to 110% damage and generates 9% adrenaline. But what if there was a variation that dealt 90 to 100% damage and generated 12% adrenaline? A second variation that dealt 30 to 70% damage, generated 7% adrenaline, but dealt damage in a 3x3 area around the target, very similar to Blood Barrage. A third variation would be that auto attacks dealt 60 to 120% damage, generated 9% adrenaline, but had a 50% chance to gain a necrosis stack and a 20% chance to gain a soul stack. A fourth variation, where auto attacks dealt 100 to 120% damage, generated 8% adrenaline, but healed for 15% of the damage that they dealt. And a fifth variation of auto attacks where it would hit twice for 40 to 50% damage, generate 9% adrenaline, but critical strikes would reduce all necromancy cooldowns by 0.6 seconds. My head is running off a lot of these ideas, so I want to include one more before we move on. What if Living Death lost a few of its effects, but during its buff period, your auto attack cooldown was reduced down to 1.2 seconds, and all 0-second cooldown abilities like Volley of Souls and Finger of Death became off-global cooldown abilities? The possibilities and potential with the talent tree are truly limitless. Also, I just want to make it clear that these suggested ideas are not set in stone nor balanced in numbers. They're just examples to promote what could be possible with necromancy and a talent system. Lastly, I know this is probably a concern with this idea, but if it was up to me, I would ensure that respeccing the talent system would be completely free, since I've never enjoyed the idea of taxing players who want to try something different. I would also integrate it into the preset system so that players are able to customize certain presets to automatically load specific talents. Imagine how better received the Archaeology Relic system would be if these two changes were implemented. Switching relics would be free and it'd be tied to your presets, meaning players could customize their divination preset to have divination relics tied into them, so when they load their preset after using combat relics, it would not only switch your inventory and gear like it normally does, but also your archaeology relics. Next, we have the skilling side of necromancy, rituals. Rituals aren't only an alternative method of training necromancy, but it's also a core element in leveling up your talents and gathering resources that will help elevate your gameplay. As a disclaimer, we were only able to engage with the lower level rituals, so my views on it might not be fully justified. The fundamental mechanics of rituals are pretty straightforward. You buy basic resources within the city to place on the ritual site, then you use an item as an offering. Your offering is consumed, however your basic resources like candles and glyphs degrade, meaning you only need to repair them rather than having to place them down again. The gameplay experience felt very simple, where you can start a ritual and AFK for a long period of time with a choice to click Ghost, which by the way I can imagine will be difficult to spot on the release of the skill since there'll be a ton of players moving around the location. And this is not really an issue for the early game of rituals, but I hope it gets fleshed out in the later game. Conclusively, I felt rituals lacked a lot of depth, and there was a lot of room to encourage theory crafting similar to invention gizmos, providing players with the most simplistic forms of rituals, but also encouraging them to discover bonus combinations and positions. Let's talk about necromancy on release and potential training method concerns. Training this skill through conventional combat methods on release might be a very negative experience for a significant portion of players, as all worlds and all good training locations will be massively overpopulated. Take Invention as a case study. The skill only partially became an efficient combat skill after a few days post-release, meaning not as many people were doing combat, and still there were players constantly crashing each other, harassing each other, and ultimately purposely griefing each other. It became such a toxic cesspool and ruined the experience for many. Let's use a more recent example, like Abyssal Lords, where players gave up caring about them since they couldn't enjoy the content without having to constantly fight others for kills and XP. And in some cases, people's experience was hopping worlds for 5 minutes, finding a spot, setting down and killing the Abyssal Lord just to be crashed by someone within seconds. It was just not fun. Suggesting rituals as an alternative method of training to counteract this would not be acceptable, as players should be encouraged to use the application of the skill. To further this point, it would be pretty bad if someone trained through rituals entirely to a high level before touching the combat side of the skill, since they'll be overwhelmed by the amount of abilities that they'll have to learn at once. I imagine a lot of players will resort to the use of player-owned Slayer dungeon, but not everyone has the required 99 Slayer. I understand that this will only be the case for the first few weeks post-release, but first impressions matter. You don't want people to give up on the skill in the first few days and quit. The first couple of days of a new piece of content being launched is always the most exciting moment to get involved alongside everyone else, and personally it's the most fun I have in MMOs, so I don't want to dampen that hype and sense of discovery with players not being able to get stuck in with combat without focusing on competing with others. A band-aid solution to this would be to set up temporary instances to all predicted dungeons that would be crowded, similar to the new crypt containing armored phantoms. A better solution, however, suggested by someone within my community, was to instance monsters rather than dungeons and areas. This would not only make combat a social experience, but also it would zero the toxicity that usually escalates from natural competition. Next up, I want to talk about the lore. JX keeps telling us that we're good necromancers, that conjurations are brought up willingly with their consent, but it never felt that way. At this moment, it feels like you're just summoning a random ghost, zombie, and skeleton. A way to give this more meaning is by creating an emotional connection between the player and their conjuration. For example, have a mini quest where you help an undead character with whatever regret that they might carry. Maybe they left some unfinished business in the overworld, maybe they just want to have some fun, or maybe they won't fight under someone they consider weak, so you have to prove yourself against them, earning their trust, respect, and consent to be summoned. There could even be abilities that summon a hero character to do one action. Here are some notable signature characters that could work. General Vigora, a Zerosian general who sets his most fearsome beasts from the Slayer Tower onto your enemies. Commodore Matthias, a respected Void Knight who enhances your damage to deal chain lightning, similar to the Karasi sword. Colonel Grimson of the Red Axe Gang, making his entry with a redemption arc, charging into their target, dealing massive damage and stunning them for a whopping 6 seconds. A forgotten Barrow's brother who did not see eye to eye with his brothers when it came to fame and glory, only caring for justice. A legendary Ilujanken known for their fearless dragon riding. Arav, the renowned knight of Varrock, making his comeback to battle against Imrugal and other necromantic threats, as he knows all too well how it feels to be enslaved against your will. Elvarg, wanting to feel alive again with the thrill of combat. Zanuck, just so she can die again. Finally, let's talk about the artistic side of necromancy.
Show me what you have learned, my apprentice. I've made it so easy for you to grasp the intricacies of this rather unique skill.
God damn, the music is so good. Most of the reveal videos, I ended up being too focused on the music and completely missed what all the developers were saying, so I had to always watch it twice. And the area design is also so spectacular. The range, the vision is just so good. I don't know, man. I feel like I'm always a sucker when it comes to RuneScape music and environmental design. I'm a big fan. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, guys, and hope you guys enjoyed. Take care.